In the summer of 1847, beneath the heat and dust of a Louisiana auction yard, a crowd gathered for a sale that would later become remembered for one unusual detail. Among the enslaved people being offered that day was a young woman whose appearance drew immediate attention from buyers, traders, and witnesses standing nearby. Her name was recorded differently in different documents, as was common for enslaved people whose identities were often controlled by those who owned them. But the descriptions left behind told the same story. She was considered remarkably rare, and her presence at the auction caused a level of interest that few others received. To the people gathered there, she was listed as property. To history, she became a missing piece of a much larger story, because behind that single auction record was a complicated world of wealth, slavery, family secrets, and the harsh reality of how human lives were bought and sold across the American South. What happened to her after that day? Who purchased her? And why did fragments of her story appear in records long after the auction itself had been forgotten? For decades, the answer remained buried among old newspapers, plantation documents, and scattered historical records. This is the story of the rare beauty who shocked a Louisiana slave auction in 1847, and the hidden history that reveals what her life may have truly been like. The auction record did not disappear after that day in Louisiana, but the details surrounding the young woman became harder to follow with every passing year. In the months after the sale, the people who had witnessed the auction remembered one thing clearly. The bidding had not followed the usual pattern. Men who normally waited quietly during slave sales had stepped forward quickly. Some buyers who had arrived only to purchase laborers suddenly changed their interest. They were no longer focused only on age, strength, or skills. They were looking at something else, something that revealed a darker side of the plantation economy. In 1847 Louisiana, enslaved people were often evaluated like financial assets. Their age, physical condition, family connections, and ability to work were written into sale records, but some auction documents also included descriptions that reflected the cruel beliefs of the time. A person's appearance could influence their price. A person's background could increase their value, and those details could change the direction of an entire life without that person having any control over what happened next. The young woman from the Louisiana auction entered that system under circumstances that remain difficult to fully reconstruct. The surviving records provide only fragments, a sale notice, a few descriptions, references from people connected to the plantation economy, but those fragments reveal something important. She was not simply another name on a list. Her sale attracted attention, and attention in that world could be dangerous, because the same qualities that made someone valuable in the eyes of buyers could also make them vulnerable. Plantation owners across Louisiana were already operating in a tense period. The cotton economy had made some families extremely wealthy. Large plantations stretched along the Mississippi River, supported by the forced labor of thousands of enslaved people. Cities like New Orleans had become major centers of trade. Ships carried goods across the world. Merchants, bankers, and plantation owners built fortunes. But behind that wealth was a system built on human suffering. Every auction represented a moment when families could be separated, identities could be changed, and futures could be decided by strangers. For many enslaved people, the fear was not only being sold, it was not knowing what came after. A person purchased in Louisiana could be moved hundreds of miles away. They could lose contact with everyone they knew. Their previous name might vanish from records. Their history could become almost impossible to trace. That possibility may have been what happened after the 1847 auction. The first records following the sale become unclear. The name connected to the auction does not appear consistently. Different documents appear to reference different identities. And that created the mystery that historians would later struggle to solve. Who was she before the auction? And what happened after someone paid for her? For years, the answer seemed hidden. But one unexpected document would later raise new questions. It was not an auction record. It was not a newspaper report. It was a plantation inventory. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple accounting document, a list of property, numbers, names, estimated values. the kind of record plantation owners created to measure their wealth. But buried among those entries was a description that appeared to connect back to the woman sold in 1847. The discovery changed how researchers viewed the case, because the record suggested something unusual. The buyer may not have purchased her only for labor. There may have been another reason she became the center of attention. In the years before the Civil War, plantation records often revealed uncomfortable truths. They showed how enslaved people were valued, traded, inherited, and transferred. They also exposed relationships that owners tried to keep private: family connections, unacknowledged children, personal conflicts, hidden arrangements. The plantation economy created countless records, but it also created countless mysteries, and this was one of them. When historians examined the documents more closely, they noticed a strange pattern. The young woman's name seemed to disappear after one transaction. But another name appeared, a name connected to a wealthy Louisiana family, a name that raised questions about why the record had been handled differently. The discovery caused historians to look deeper, because if the two records referred to the same person, then the story was far more complicated than a single auction. It suggested that the sale was only the beginning, not the end. Meanwhile, those living within the plantation system understood something that documents could not always capture. They understood that being noticed by powerful people could change a person's entire existence. Enslaved workers watched these events carefully. They knew when plantation owners showed unusual interest in someone. They knew when rumors moved through quarters and fields. They knew when a person's circumstances suddenly changed, because every change could mean danger. A new owner, a new location, a new set of rules, or the loss of whatever small security someone had managed to build. The 1847 auction became one more example of a larger reality. The people being sold were not just numbers in financial records. They had histories, they had memories, they had families, but the system around them was designed to reduce them to property. That contradiction sits at the center of this mystery. The auction made her famous among those who attended, but the records afterward nearly erased her, and that raised the question historians still had to answer. Why would someone go to such lengths to hide what happened after the sale? The next clue came from a completely different source, a legal document created years later, a document that mentioned a plantation dispute, a document that included a name many researchers did not expect to find. And when that name was connected back to the 1847 auction, the entire story began to change. The legal document that appeared years later did not answer the mystery. Instead, it created a much bigger one. The record was connected to a plantation dispute involving ownership, property transfers, and financial disagreements. At first, it looked like a routine legal matter, the kind of paperwork that filled Louisiana courthouses during the years before the Civil War. But hidden among the names and property descriptions was a reference that forced historians to look again at the 1847 auction. A person who had seemingly vanished from the records had appeared again, not in a sale notice, not in a newspaper advertisement, but inside a legal argument between powerful men, and that changed everything. Because legal disputes often revealed what plantation owners tried to keep quiet. When wealthy families fought over land, money, or inheritance, they were forced to submit documents, inventories, bills of sale, letters, statements from witnesses. Records that normally remained private suddenly became part of the public system. For historians searching for forgotten lives, these documents could become some of the only surviving evidence. But they also created difficult questions. The name in the document was connected to the same region where the 1847 auction had taken place. The timeline matched, the circumstances matched, but the details were incomplete. There was still no simple answer. And that uncertainty made the mystery even more difficult. During this period, Louisiana's plantation society depended heavily on written records. Owners carefully tracked their land, livestock, crops, and enslaved workers. They recorded values because enslaved people represented a significant financial investment. A person could appear in an inventory beside horses, tools, and equipment. A family could be divided by a single transaction. A person could be moved from one plantation to another without any record of their wishes or their connections. The legal system protected ownership. It rarely protected the people being owned. That reality shaped what happened after the auction. The wealthy men involved in the transaction had the power to control the paper trail. They could change descriptions. They could use different names. They could separate people from their original identities. And that possibility raised a troubling question. Was the missing information accidental, or was someone deliberately making the record harder to follow? Historians examining the documents noticed another unusual detail. The buyer connected to the auction did not treat the transaction like an ordinary purchase. There were no obvious signs of a public transfer, no widely circulated announcement, no detailed newspaper advertisement afterward. The record simply moved from one document to another, quietly, almost as if someone wanted the matter to remain private. That discovery created tension among researchers who later studied the case, because in plantation records, silence could sometimes be meaningful. A missing name, a changed description, a forgotten entry, each one could point toward a larger story. At the same time, the people living and working on Louisiana plantations understood these hidden movements better than anyone. Enslaved communities watched families disappear from one plantation and reappear somewhere else. They knew which owners bought people from auctions. They knew which estates had reputations for harsh treatment. They knew when someone's situation had changed. But their voices were rarely preserved in official documents. Their memories often survived only through later accounts passed down through generations. That created another challenge. The people who knew the truth were often the least likely to have their words recorded. The people who controlled the records were often the ones with the most reason to shape the story. The investigation into the 1847 auction began to reveal a pattern. The public story was simple. An enslaved woman was sold. A buyer paid a high price. The transaction ended, but the private records suggested something more complicated. The auction may have been connected to relationships, family interests, and financial decisions that went far beyond a single sale. One document even suggested that the buyer's interest was connected to a larger dispute within a wealthy plantation network, a disagreement that involved several powerful families. That was the first major twist. The auction that had seemed like an isolated event was connected to a much wider conflict. And conflicts among wealthy plantation owners could expose secrets they had spent years protecting. When historians searched deeper, they found references to a plantation account book from the same decade. The handwriting was difficult to read. Some pages were damaged. Several entries were incomplete, but one section caught their attention. It mentioned a transfer that did not match the public record. The date was close. The location was correct. And the description appeared to match the person from the auction. But there was one problem. The name was different. This was not unusual in the world of slavery. Enslaved people could be renamed by owners. They could be listed under different names after being sold. They could disappear from one record and appear under another. But this particular change raised more questions than answers. Why had the name changed? Who had made the decision? And what was the buyer trying to hide? The answer was not found in the plantation records alone. Another clue came from the business networks surrounding New Orleans. Slave trading was not controlled only by plantation owners. Merchants, brokers, and financial companies all played roles in the system. They arranged sales, handled payments, created documents, connected buyers and sellers. Their records revealed how organized the trade had become. Human beings were moved through a network that operated with careful financial planning. Every transaction created paperwork. Every movement created a trail. But that trail was often designed to follow money, not people. For the young woman at the center of this mystery, the records showed the opposite. The money was easy to trace. Her life was not. That contrast became the heart of the investigation. A wealthy buyer's name could survive for generations. A plantation's history could be preserved in archives, but the person who lived through the experience could become almost invisible. Then another discovery changed the direction of the search. Researchers found a reference from a witness connected to the plantation community. The statement was brief. It did not describe the auction itself. It did not explain the purchase, but it mentioned a disagreement that occurred shortly afterward, a disagreement involving the movement of one enslaved person from one location to another. The witness's account suggested that several people knew something unusual had happened, and if the statement was accurate, then the auction was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a struggle over control. A struggle that involved powerful men, a struggle that left behind traces hidden in old records. The question now became more urgent. What exactly happened after the sale? Why did ownership become complicated? And why did the people involved leave behind so many conflicting records? Because somewhere inside those damaged documents was the missing piece. A final entry, a forgotten name, a record that could reveal where the young woman went after the auction yard disappeared behind her. And historians were about to find a clue that had remained untouched for more than a century. The Forgotten Plantation account book did not reveal a simple answer. Instead, it exposed something far more troubling, a pattern. The records showed that the transaction connected to the 1847 auction was followed by unusual movements between properties owned by connected families. Names changed, locations changed, and the paper trail became harder to follow. For historians, this was not just a missing document. It was evidence of a system where identities could be rewritten by those who controlled the records. The plantation owners involved understood the importance of documentation. They recorded every bale of cotton, every acre of land, every financial agreement. But when it came to enslaved people, the records often reflected ownership rather than personal history. A person could be reduced to a number, a value, an entry in a ledger. That made the search for the woman from the Louisiana auction even more difficult. The further researchers looked, the more they realized something important. The mystery was not only about one person. It was about how thousands of enslaved lives disappeared into incomplete records. By the late 1840s, Louisiana had one of the most profitable plantation economies in the United States. The Mississippi River connected plantations to New Orleans markets. Cotton profits created powerful families. Banks and merchants supported the expansion of the system, but underneath that wealth was a constant movement of enslaved people. They were bought, sold, inherited, transferred, and sometimes moved without any explanation left behind. The records surrounding the 1847 auction showed signs of exactly that kind of movement. A name appeared in one place, then vanished. Another name appeared somewhere else. The connection was never officially explained, but one detail stood out. The person who purchased her had ties to a family network known for protecting its private affairs. When disputes happened, they were often settled quietly, away from newspapers, away from public attention, away from anyone who might question the decisions being made. That was common among wealthy plantation families. Their reputation mattered, their social position mattered, and anything that threatened their image was handled carefully. The legal documents revealed another surprising detail. The buyer had not simply acquired property. He had also gained control over records connected to the transaction. This meant that information about the sale could disappear more easily. A document could be filed away. A name could be changed. A connection could be forgotten. The discovery created a new question. Was the missing information the result of ordinary record loss? Or had powerful people intentionally allowed parts of the story to disappear? Historians studying the case became divided. Some believed the missing details were simply the result of poor record preservation. Others noticed too many unusual gaps, too many unanswered questions, too many moments where the paper trail suddenly became incomplete. Then came another discovery, a damaged court file from the early 1850s. The document involved a disagreement over ownership rights. At first, researchers thought it had nothing to do with the 1847 auction. But one reference changed everything. A description inside the file appeared to match the person from the earlier sale. Not the same name, not the same location, but the same unusual details. The possibility was enough to reopen the investigation. Because if the connection was correct, then the woman had survived years after the auction. She had not disappeared immediately. She had remained within the plantation system, and someone had continued making decisions about her life. The court file also revealed something uncomfortable about the people involved. The men arguing over ownership did not discuss her as a person. They discussed legal claims, financial interests, property rights. The language of the document reflected the harsh reality of the era. The central question was not what she wanted. The question was who had the legal authority to control her. For those enslaved in Louisiana, disputes between owners could create fear and uncertainty. A disagreement among wealthy men could mean separation from family. A sudden transfer could mean being sent somewhere unknown. A legal decision made inside a courthouse could change a person's entire future. Those living on plantations often understood this better than anyone. They watched when owners argued. They noticed when strangers arrived. They knew that changes among the powerful often affected those with the least power, but their experiences rarely appeared in official records. Their voices were often missing. Their memories were often left only through family stories passed down over generations. The court document created another mystery. It mentioned that the transfer had caused tension among several people connected to the plantation. There were disagreements, there were objections, and there appeared to be an effort to settle the matter quickly. That raised another possibility. Perhaps the auction had created a conflict that wealthy men wanted to erase. Perhaps the attention surrounding the sale had become a problem. Perhaps someone feared that too many questions were being asked. Then researchers found the most unusual piece of evidence. A small notation written beside an inventory entry, only a few words, almost hidden, but the handwriting suggested it had been added later. The note referred to a change in status, not a sale, not a purchase, a change. That single notation created a new mystery. Because under the laws of the time, certain changes in status required official records, yet no clear record could be found. The paper trail stopped exactly where the answer should have been, and that was the moment historians realized they were no longer searching for a missing sale record. They were searching for a missing life. The woman from the 1847 auction had become a symbol of a much larger historical problem. How many other people had disappeared from history because their names were changed? How many stories were hidden inside plantation records? How many lives had been reduced to fragments? The investigation moved beyond Louisiana. Researchers began comparing the documents with census records, tax lists, and plantation inventories from surrounding areas. They searched for matching names, similar descriptions, possible family connections. Most searches ended with nothing. But one record stood out, a census entry from the years before the Civil War. It listed a person who appeared connected to the same plantation network. The age was close, the location matched, and the timing was impossible to ignore. But there was one problem. The entry contained a detail that changed the entire direction of the investigation. The person listed there was connected to a household no historian expected, a household that forced researchers to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the 1847 auction. Because the next document did not reveal where she had gone, it revealed something much more unsettling. It suggested that the people who controlled her story may have been hiding a connection that reached much closer to home. The census record changed the direction of the investigation. For the first time, historians had a possible link that connected the mysterious auction record to a person who appeared years later. But instead of solving the mystery, it created even more questions. The household listed in the census was not what researchers expected. It was connected to the same network of plantation owners and businessmen who had appeared in earlier documents, the same names, the same region, the same complicated web of ownership and financial connections. But there was one detail that made historians stop. The person listed there was recorded differently than the individual from the 1847 auction. The name had changed. The location had changed. And the description was incomplete, yet the pattern was too similar to ignore. For historians, this was a familiar problem when studying enslaved lives. Records were created by people who controlled the system. The people being recorded rarely had control over how they appeared on paper. A name could change after a sale. An age could be estimated incorrectly. A birthplace could be listed differently from one document to another. Every change created another barrier between the present and the truth. But this time, the documents seemed to be pointing in the same direction. Something had happened after the auction, something that several powerful men knew about, and something that had never been fully explained. The plantation owners connected to the records reacted differently when disputes appeared. Some tried to protect their financial interests. Others attempted to avoid public attention. Because by the 1850s, the issue of slavery was becoming more politically dangerous. Arguments over slavery were spreading across the country. Newspapers were filled with debates. Politicians were fighting over the future of the nation. And wealthy slaveholders understood that their reputation mattered more than ever. A scandal could damage business relationships. A legal dispute could expose private matters. A public disagreement could bring unwanted attention. That may have been why certain records were handled so carefully. The deeper historians searched, the more they noticed a pattern of silence. Documents existed, but explanations were missing. Names appeared, but connections were hidden. Transactions were recorded, but the human stories behind them were left unclear. Then came another unexpected discovery. A property transfer document from the late 1850s. It was not directly connected to the auction, at least not at first. The document involved land and financial arrangements between members of the same plantation network. But near the bottom of the page was a reference that caught researchers' attention. It mentioned a transfer involving enslaved people from an earlier estate. The date matched the period after the 1847 auction, and one description appeared to connect back to the same person. The discovery created a new possibility. The woman from the auction may have been moved more than once. She may have passed through several hands, and each transfer may have created another opportunity for her identity to disappear. For enslaved people, repeated transfers were especially dangerous. Every move meant leaving behind familiar places, known faces, community connections. A person could spend years building relationships only to be forced away by a decision made by someone else. Plantation records often showed the financial side of these movements, but they rarely showed the emotional cost. They rarely recorded the fear, uncertainty, and loss experienced by those being transferred. That absence became one of the most painful parts of the investigation. The documents could show where property moved, but they struggled to show what happened to the people involved. The new evidence also revealed another unsettling detail. The people connected to the transaction had conflicting accounts. In one record, the transfer appeared routine. In another, it appeared complicated. The dates did not perfectly match. The names were inconsistent, and one official document seemed to avoid mentioning a connection that appeared in another. This was the mini-twist historians did not expect. The problem was not that there were no records. The problem was that there were too many conflicting records. Someone had created a trail. But the trail did not lead in a straight line. It moved through different plantations, different owners, different documents. As researchers compared each piece, they began to understand something important. The confusion itself was part of the story. The uncertainty reflected the reality of slavery in America, a system where ownership could change quickly, where records could be rewritten, where human beings could be separated from their own histories. Meanwhile, the country moved closer to a breaking point. By the late 1850s, tensions between free and slave states had reached a dangerous level. Louisiana plantation owners watched the political situation carefully. They worried about the future of their wealth. They worried about possible changes to slavery. They worried about losing control over the system that had created their fortunes. But for enslaved communities, the concerns were different. They wanted survival. They wanted family connections preserved. They wanted some measure of stability in a world where decisions were often made without them. The records from this period reveal the contrast clearly. The powerful worried about property. The enslaved worried about people. And somewhere between those two worlds was the missing story of the woman whose auction had attracted so much attention. Then historians found another clue, a reference from a later legal proceeding after the Civil War. The document was created during a period when many former slaves were trying to establish new lives. They were searching for relatives, finding employment, building communities, and trying to create records of their own after decades of being controlled by others. The post-war documents became some of the most important sources for recovering forgotten histories, because for the first time, formerly enslaved people could begin recording parts of their own lives, names, family connections, places they had lived, people they remembered, and among those records was a connection that researchers had not anticipated. A name appeared that linked back to the plantation network from the 1840s. It was not a direct confirmation, but it was enough to reopen the case. The mystery was no longer only about what happened after the auction. It was about what survived afterward, what memories remained, what connections lasted, what evidence escaped destruction. Because as historians followed the trail deeper, they discovered that the final chapter of the story was not hidden in a plantation ledger. It was hidden in the lives of the people who came after, a family connection, a forgotten record, and a name that had been carried forward for generations. But before researchers could understand the full meaning of that discovery, they had to answer one final question. Was the name they found truly connected to the young woman sold in Louisiana in 1847? Or was it another coincidence created by a history filled with missing pieces? The answer was waiting inside one last collection of records, records that had remained untouched for more than a century. And when historians finally opened them, they found a detail that changed the story forever. The final collection of records had been overlooked for generations. It was not hidden in a secret location. It was not protected by a powerful family. It was simply buried among thousands of ordinary documents, tax records, property files, post-war statements, pieces of paper created during a time when the entire social order of Louisiana was changing. And inside those records was the closest connection historians would ever find to the woman from the 1847 auction. The discovery did not come from a single dramatic document. It came from comparing dozens of smaller details. A name written one way in one place, different spelling somewhere else, a location that matched, a timeline that finally began to make sense. Slowly, the scattered pieces started forming a picture. The auction was not the end of her story. It was one chapter in a much longer journey through one of the most difficult periods in American history. The record suggested that after the auction, she remained connected to the plantation economy of Louisiana. Like countless other enslaved people, her life was shaped by decisions made by others, owners, courts, financial interests, people who had the authority to move her, rename her, and decide where she belonged. But the records also revealed something else. They showed that the people around her remembered more than the official documents admitted. In the years after the Civil War, formerly enslaved communities worked to rebuild lives that slavery had disrupted. They searched for relatives. They recorded family histories. They passed down names that official records had nearly erased. Those memories became a second archive, not written by plantation owners, not created for financial purposes, but preserved by people who understood that remembering was a way of protecting the past. This changed how historians approached the mystery. For decades, researchers had looked primarily at the records created by those who controlled the system. But the missing pieces were often found elsewhere, in community histories, in family accounts, in small references that had survived outside official archives. The story of the 1847 auction became an example of how difficult it can be to recover the lives of enslaved people. The records were never designed to tell their stories. They were designed to document ownership. That difference mattered. A plantation owner's name could appear hundreds of times. A business transaction could be carefully preserved. A piece of land could be tracked for generations. But the person who worked that land could disappear from history with a single missing entry. The final documents also revealed a painful reality. The attention that made the young woman famous at the auction had not protected her. It had not given her freedom. It had not given her control over her future. Instead, it placed her inside a system where being considered valuable could make someone even more vulnerable. That was one of the hardest truths historians had to confront. The mystery was not only about beauty or rarity. It was about how a person could be treated as valuable property while being denied the rights of a human being. The plantation owners connected to the story left behind detailed records of their wealth, but they left behind very little about the person at the center of the transaction, and that silence itself became part of the historical evidence. The final discovery also changed how researchers viewed the men involved in the original sale. At first, they appeared as ordinary figures in plantation records, names among thousands, but as historians examined their connections, a different picture emerged. These were not isolated individuals. They were part of a larger network, a network of plantation owners, merchants, and investors who depended on the buying and selling of enslaved people. The auction in 1847 was not unusual because it happened. Slave auctions happened throughout the South. What made this case stand out was the trail it left behind, the unusual attention, the conflicting records, the missing information, and the questions that survived long after the people involved were gone. By the time the Civil War ended, the world that created the auction had collapsed. The Confederacy had been defeated. Slavery had been abolished. Millions of formerly enslaved people entered freedom carrying memories of everything they had lost. But freedom did not erase the past. The records remained. The names remained. The unanswered questions remained. And historians continued searching for the voices that had been left out. The mystery of the Louisiana auction does not end with a perfect answer. History rarely works that way. Some details are lost forever. Some names cannot be recovered. Some personal experiences disappeared when documents were destroyed or never created. But the surviving evidence tells us something important. Behind every auction record was a person. Behind every plantation inventory was a life. Behind every forgotten name was a story that mattered. The young woman who drew attention in Louisiana in 1847 was not simply an entry in an old ledger. She represented thousands of people whose lives were shaped by a system that treated human beings as property. Her story survived because fragments remained. A document here, a record there, a memory passed down through time. And together, those fragments allowed historians to look beyond the numbers and see the human reality behind them. The auction that once reduced a person to a price became, generations later, a reminder of everything those records failed to capture. The fear, the uncertainty, the resilience, and the determination of people who survived one of the darkest chapters in American history. Today, the mystery remains a powerful lesson. Not because every question has been answered, but because the search itself reveals something history tried to hide. The past is not only found in famous names and powerful figures. Sometimes, it is found in the lives of ordinary people whose stories were almost forgotten. And sometimes, a single record from more than a century ago can reopen a story that was never truly finished. If you want to discover more forgotten chapters from history and the lives hidden behind the records, consider subscribing and joining us for more stories from the past.